Before we begin, I'd love to know, if someone spent years quietly loving you from afar, would you find it romantic or unsettling? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like the video and subscribe. Now, let's step into today's story. The morning of her wedding, Ilara Voss ironed her own dress. There was no lady's maid, no flowers delivered to her door, no note from the groom. Just the gray silk she had purchased herself, the iron she had borrowed from the landlady downstairs, and the quiet that filled her small London rooms like something that had decided to stay. She had known for 6 weeks that she was to marry the Duke of Ashvern. She had not spoken to him once. The church of St. Edmund's in Mayfair was full when she arrived, not full because of her, full because a duke's wedding drew the kind of crowd that wore their best pearls on a Tuesday morning and whispered behind painted fans without any shame. Ilara walked down the aisle alone. Her father had died 3 years prior. Her mother had not been invited. She did not look left or right. She kept her eyes on the altar and her chin level, and her hands still around the small bouquet of white roses she had bought from a street vendor on the corner of Grosvenor Square, because no one had thought to provide one. He was already waiting at the altar. Raphael Cole, the Duke of Ashvern. She had seen his portrait once in a newspaper society column. It had not prepared her. He was tall, with dark hair cut close and shoulders that filled his morning coat without effort. His jaw was hard. His eyes, when they found hers as she approached, were the color of slate after rain, gray, cold, and completely unreadable. He did not smile. He did not reach for her hand. He simply watched her walk toward him the way a man watches something he has already decided about. The ceremony lasted 19 minutes. Ilara knew because she counted. She said her vows clearly and without trembling. He said his in a voice so low and controlled it barely reached the first pew. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife. The Duke did not kiss her. He offered her his arm instead, and she took it, and they walked back down the aisle together past 300 people who would spend the rest of the season speculating about why the Duke of Ashvern had married a woman no one had ever heard of. Ilara Catherine Voss was 24 years old and had been, until 6 weeks ago, a music teacher. She taught piano to the daughters of minor gentry in Kensington, arriving each morning with her music case and leaving each evening with enough to pay her rent and her mother's medicine and very little else. She was not plain, but she was not remarkable. She had dark hair she wore simply, amber eyes that people sometimes called unusual, and a quality of stillness that her students' mothers alternately described as composed and unsettling. She had no fortune, no connections, no title. She received the Duke's solicitor on a Thursday afternoon in October, expecting a legal matter regarding her late father's modest estate. What she received instead was an offer of marriage from a man she had never met, accompanied by a settlement so generous that it had made her sit down on the nearest chair and stare at the wallpaper for a full minute. She had asked the solicitor why. The solicitor had cleared his throat and said that His Grace had identified Miss Voss as a suitable candidate for the position of Duchess, and that the terms were generous and the arrangement was advantageous for all parties. She had asked again, why her? The solicitor had said he was not at liberty to say. She had accepted, because her mother was dying and the medicine cost more each month, and there was no other answer available to her that did not end in ruin. That was the whole of it, or so she believed. Ashvern Hall sat on the edge of the Wiltshire countryside like a man who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Gray stone walls, tall iron gates, grounds that stretched in every direction until they met the horizon, and the horizon had the good sense to yield. Ilara arrived by carriage in the late afternoon on the day after the wedding. The Duke had traveled separately. She had not been surprised. The housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Holt, met her at the front entrance with a curtsy that was precise but not warm. The staff assembled in the entrance hall were formal, correct, and entirely silent. Ilara thanked them. She meant it. Mrs. Holt showed her to the Duchess's chambers on the second floor, a suite of rooms so large and so carefully appointed that Ilara stood in the center of the bedroom for a full minute simply looking. Fresh flowers on the writing desk, a fire already lit, a gown of deep blue laid out on the chair that she had never seen before and that fit her when she tried it later that evening as though it had been made for her measurements specifically. She called for the housemaid. "When did this gown arrive, Your Grace?" The girl, young, copper-haired, with the expression of someone trying very hard to say nothing, said it had been there for some time, Your Grace. "How long?" Ilara asked. The girl said she couldn't rightly say, but her eyes said something else entirely. She did not see the Duke until dinner. He was already seated at the head of the long table when she entered the dining room, reading correspondence by candlelight, his dark head bent slightly forward. He looked up when she entered and set the papers aside and stood, which she had not expected. "Your Grace," she said. He said her name, just that, Ilara, as though he had been saying it for years. She sat at the opposite end of the table, 12 feet of polished mahogany between them. The servants moved silently around them, bringing soup and bread and a roast that smelled of rosemary and thyme. They did not speak for the first 10 minutes. Then she said, "The house is beautiful." He said, "It is yours now." She said, "I am aware of the legal arrangement." Something moved across his face, quick and gone. He said, "That is not what I meant." She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. After dinner, he excused himself to his study. She walked back to her chambers alone through corridors lit by candlelight, passing portraits of Ashvern ancestors who watched her from their frames with the particular expression of people who knew something she did not. On her third morning at Ashvern Hall, Ilara went exploring. She told herself it was practical. She was the Duchess. She ought to know her own house. She found the library, the conservatory, the morning room, the portrait gallery, and a billiards room that smelled of old leather and pipe smoke. She found a music room on the eastern wing with a pianoforte that had not been touched in years, its keys yellowed at the edges, a layer of dust on the lid. She sat down and played. She had not played for herself in months, always for students, always measured and instructional. Now she played the piece her father had taught her when she was 7, a slow and aching melody that filled the room and slipped out under the door and moved through the corridor beyond. She did not hear the Duke stop in the hallway outside. She did not see him stand there for the entire length of the piece. When she finished and turned, the corridor was empty, but the door, which she had left open, was now almost closed, as though someone had begun to pull it shut and then stopped. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she went back to the keys and played it again. Lady Victoria Marne arrived on the 5th day. She came without invitation, in a carriage bearing the Marne family crest, wearing a gown of ivory silk that was almost the color of a wedding dress and a smile that had been practiced into something very close to genuine. She was beautiful, dark-eyed, porcelain-skinned, with a bearing that came from being told since birth that rooms rearranged themselves for you. She had, Ilara learned from Mrs. Holt's carefully neutral expression, been a frequent visitor to Ashvern Hall for the past 3 years. Lady Victoria embraced the air beside Ilara's cheeks and called her "my dear," and said she had been simply desperate to meet the woman who had finally convinced Raphael to marry. She said finally with a particular weight. She said convinced with something sharper underneath it. Over tea in the drawing room, Lady Victoria said, "We had all quite given up hope, you know. He refused everyone, simply everyone. 3 full seasons of introductions, and not a single one met his standards." She laughed, light and musical. "We began to wonder if his standards existed at all." Ilara said nothing. She poured the tea. Lady Victoria watched her pour the tea and said, "Of course, the arrangements for a match like this are always a little," she paused, "unconventional." Ilara set down the teapot and looked at her directly and said, "Are they?" It was not a question. Lady Victoria's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalculated. She left an hour later saying she must return for a dinner engagement and that they simply must become great friends.
Ilara stood at the window and watched the carriage roll down the gravel drive. Refused everyone, Lady Victoria had said. 3 full seasons. Ilara thought about the gown that fit her measurements, the flowers on the desk, the solicitor who had not been at liberty to say. She thought about the door in the music room, almost closed. She went to find Mrs. Holt. Mrs. Holt was in the linen room, cataloging sheets with the focused energy of a woman who treated domestic order as a moral position. Ilara asked, "How long had you been at Ashvern Hall?" Mrs. Holt said, 22 years, Your Grace." Ilara asked, "When did the Duke begin looking for a wife?" Mrs. Holt went very still over the sheets. Then she said, 3 years ago, when His Grace turned 30 and the terms of his father's estate required it."
Ilara said, "And in 3 years he found no one suitable?" Mrs. Holt said, "No one he would agree to, Your Grace. There is a difference." Ilara asked what the difference was. Mrs. Holt folded a sheet with great precision and said, "His Grace is a man who knows what he wants and will not settle for anything less." She paused. "He never has." Ilara said, "And what did he want?" Mrs. Holt looked at her then, directly, with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite warmth, but something between them that was more honest than either. She said, "I think that is a question you should ask His Grace, Your Grace." Then she went back to her sheets. Ilara did not ask the Duke that evening or the next. She was not afraid of him, she was afraid of the answer, because the answer had begun to take a shape she did not know how to hold. On the 8th day, she passed his study and the door was open, and she saw his desk, normally cleared, tonight covered in papers, correspondence, ledgers, and beneath the ledger at the corner, the edge of something else, a smaller document, personal rather than official. She should have kept walking. She stopped. Through the open door, she could read only the top line of the visible page. It was dated 3 years prior. It was written in a hand she did not recognize, a solicitor's hand, careful and formal. It read, "Further to your inquiry regarding Miss Ilara Catherine Voss, music teacher, daughter of the late Edward Voss of Kensington." She heard his footstep on the stair and walked on before he reached the landing, but her hands were not entirely steady for the rest of the evening. He had been asking about her 3 years ago. 3 years ago she was nobody, a music teacher in Kensington who had not heard the name Ashvern in her life. Lady Victoria returned on the 10th day, this time with 2 companions, a Mrs. Alderton and a Miss Prue Calder, both of the kind of women who smile while they dissect you. They took tea again in the drawing room. The Duke was riding. Ilara was alone. Mrs. Alderton said, "What a charming room," and meant, "What a surprising choice of Duchess." Miss Calder said, "The house must feel overwhelming for someone unused to it," and meant, "You do not belong here." Lady Victoria said nothing for the first 20 minutes. She simply watched Ilara with the focused attention of a woman taking inventory. Then she said, "Raphael and I were very close once." She said it gently, as though it were a kindness, before he became so particular. She looked at Ilara over the rim of her teacup. He changed about 3 years ago, became impossible to reach, turned down every introduction, every arrangement, every reasonable candidate. His own grandmother despaired of him. She set down her cup. And then 6 weeks ago his solicitor appeared, and he was engaged to a woman none of us had ever heard of. She smiled. "It is quite the mystery, is it not?" Ilara said, "Most worthwhile things are." Lady Victoria's smile stayed exactly where it was. She said, "I wonder sometimes whether he told you the whole truth of it. Men of his position often find honesty inconvenient." Ilara looked at her steadily and said, "I find that women who wonder out loud about another woman's marriage are usually wondering about their own regrets." The room went silent. Mrs. Alderton studied the ceiling. Miss Calder became very interested in her biscuit. Lady Victoria said nothing for a long moment. Then she laughed, a short, bright sound, and said, "I see why he chose you." She left shortly after,
and she did not come back. On the 14th night, Ilara could not sleep. She went to the library at 2 in the morning in her dressing gown and found a candle and a chair by the fire, and sat with her knees drawn up and thought about a solicitor's letter dated 3 years prior, and a gown cut to her measurements, and a door pulled almost closed. She was still there when the Duke walked in at 2:30. He stopped when he saw her. He was in shirt sleeves, no coat, no cravat, the most undone she had seen him. He looked, for one unguarded moment, like a man who had not been sleeping either. She said, "I could not sleep." He said, "Nor could I." He sat in the chair on the other side of the fire, not close, not far. They were quiet for a time. The fire was the only sound. Then Ilara said, "I saw the letter on your desk. I did not read it, but I saw the date, and I saw my name." He did not move. She said, "3 years ago I was nobody. I had no fortune, no connections, no reason to be anyone's concern, certainly not a duke's." She looked at him across the fire. "So I need to know, why were you asking about me 3 years ago?" The silence lasted long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Because I saw you." She said, "Where?" He said, "In the street, outside a house in Kensington where you taught. It was raining. You were standing on the steps with your music case, and you were looking up at the sky, not with irritation, not trying to find a cab, just looking, as though the rain was something worth paying attention to." He paused. He said, "I know how it sounds." She said, "It sounds like you watched a stranger in the rain and then arranged to marry her." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why did it take 3 years?" He said, "Because I could not justify it. You were a music teacher in Kensington, and I was this." He gestured briefly at the room, at the house, at the entirety of what he was. "I had nothing to offer you that would also cost you something." She said, "And now?" He said, "Your mother is ill. Your circumstances had changed. The terms of my father's estate required a decision. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if the arrangement was practical enough, you might accept it, and if you accepted it, then perhaps in time—" He did not finish the sentence. Ilara looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she said, "You should have told me." He said, "I know." She said, "I accepted you because I had no choice, but that is not the same as saying I would not have accepted you if I had one." She stood and gathered her dressing gown and went back upstairs. She did not sleep for the rest of the night, but for different reasons than before. Things shifted after that night, not suddenly, not loudly. The Duke began to appear. He joined her for breakfast. He asked what she was reading. He showed her the estate accounts not because he needed her help, but because, she understood, he wanted her to know the place was hers. He came to the music room one afternoon while she was playing and sat in the chair by the window without saying anything and listened until she finished. She asked if he played. He said he had learned as a boy and had not played since his mother died. She moved along the bench and said, "Sit here." He sat. She placed his hands on the keys and showed him the first chord of the piece her father had taught her. His hands were large and careful, and he pressed the notes with the concentration of a man approaching something fragile. He played it wrong 3 times. She said, "Again." He played it again. She said, "Better." He looked at her then, close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes had warmth in it that the slate comparison had missed, something quieter and older than cold. He said, "You are a better teacher than I deserve." She said, "I have not decided what you deserve yet." He almost smiled, almost. The Ashvern Winter Ball was the largest event of the Wiltshire season. 200 guests, the great hall lit by 4 chandeliers, an orchestra in the East Gallery, the kind of evening that the county attended not for pleasure, but for evidence. Evidence of fortune, of status, of who had risen and who had fallen, and who had married whom, and whether that marriage looked up close like what it was supposed to be. Elara wore the deep blue gown that had been waiting for her when she arrived. She understood now that it had been made for this night specifically, that it had been waiting here before she agreed to come. The Duke came to her door to escort her down. When she opened the door, he looked at her in the way he did in the music room, with that quiet, careful attention, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You are extraordinary." She said, "You are 3 years too late in saying so." He said, "I am aware." He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the staircase together into the hall below, where 200 people turned to look at them, and the orchestra shifted almost imperceptibly into something warmer. Lady Victoria was there. Elara saw her across the room, ivory gown again, dark eyes moving between the Duke and Elara, with an expression that had finally given up the performance of friendliness and settled into something more honest, something that looked very much like a woman watching a door close on a room she had wanted to enter long ago. Lady Victoria made her way to them within the first half hour. She said, "Raphael, you look well." He said, "Victoria." She said, "And the Duchess, you look," she paused, searching, "at home." Elara said, "I am at home." Lady Victoria smiled at the Duke and said, "I wonder if you might tell me something, Raphael, something I have been curious about since the engagement."
She looked around the gathered faces with an expression of generous candidness. Well, this was the public reckoning. This was the moment designed to diminish, to reduce, to make Elara small in front of the people who would talk about it for seasons. Elara waited for the Duke to answer. He turned to look at her first, not at Lady Victoria, at Elara, with an expression that was no longer closed or careful or controlled. Then he looked back at the room. He said, "Because I had spent 3 years looking for a reason not to choose her." He said it quietly, but the quiet had gone deep, and every person near them heard it. I was introduced to women of fortune and title and excellent families, and every introduction reminded me of something I had seen once in the rain, outside a house in Kensington, a woman who looked at a storm as though it was worth her attention. Everything else I was offered felt like a substitution. He paused. He said, "I chose her because she is the only person I have met in my adult life who made me want to be known. Not managed, not respected from a distance, known." He looked at Lady Victoria then. He said, "I hope that answers your question." The room did not erupt. It did something quieter and more devastating. It absorbed. 200 people absorbed what they had heard and rearranged their understanding and looked at Elara Voss, Duchess of Ashvern, with entirely different eyes. Lady Victoria said nothing. She set her champagne glass on the tray of a passing footman and walked away and did not speak to either of them that evening. They danced once, late in the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the orchestra had moved into slower things. She had not expected him to ask. He appeared beside her where she stood near the window and simply held out his hand. She took it. He danced the way he did everything, controlled, exact, with an undercurrent of something that was neither cold nor careless, but the opposite of both. She said, "You did not have to say all of that." He said, "I have not said enough. I have 3 years of silence to account for." She said, "Why did you not simply come back, that day in the rain? Why did you drive away?" He was quiet for one turn of the music. Then he said, "Because you looked entirely complete, standing there in the rain with your music case, looking up at the sky. You looked like a woman who had everything she needed. I had nothing to offer that seemed worth the cost of interrupting that." She said, "That is possibly the most foolish thing I have ever heard." He said, "I know." She said, "I was standing in the rain outside a house where I taught other people's children because I could not afford to do anything else, I was not complete. I was just very good at looking like I was." He looked at her then, as they moved through the last bars of the music. He said, "I know that now." She said, "You should have asked." He said, "I am asking now." He was not talking about the dancing. She held his gaze for a long moment. 3 years of a door almost closed, a gown that fit before she had agreed to wear it, a letter dated before she had known his name, a man who looked at her in the rain and then spent 3 years trying to find a justification for what he already felt. She said, "I have not decided yet whether I am angry or grateful." He said, "You are allowed to be both." She said, "I am." She did not let go of his hand when the music ended. 3 weeks after the winter ball, Ilara's mother came to Ashvern Hall. The Duke had arranged it without telling her. A room on the south side, warm and quiet, with windows overlooking the kitchen garden. A doctor who came twice a week. A nurse who was kind. Ilara found her mother settled in the chair by the window, with a cup of tea, and the cat from the village that Mrs. Holt had somehow acquired, and a look on her face that Ilara had not seen in years. Peace. Not the peace of resignation, the peace of someone who had stopped worrying. Her mother took her hand and said, "He came himself, you know, did not send a solicitor, came himself and explained the rooms and the doctor and asked what I needed and listened to the whole answer." Ilara said nothing. Her mother said, "He asked me one thing before he left." Ilara said, "What?" Her mother said, "He asked what you were like as a child, what you loved, what made you difficult." She smiled. "I told him everything. He wrote it all down." Ilara stood at the window and looked out over the grounds and felt something move through her chest. Not sharp and not sudden, something slow and certain, the way water finds level. She thought of a letter dated 3 years prior, of a gown cut to her measurements, of a door almost closed, of a man who looked at her in the rain and had not been able to stop looking since. She thought of herself at that moment, standing on those wet steps with her music case, looking up at a gray sky, completely unaware that somewhere in a stopped carriage on the street below, a duke was looking at her and making a decision he would spend 3 years trying to talk himself out of. She had not been complete, but she had been seen, and he had kept her in his sight, quietly, stubbornly, foolishly, faithfully, for every day of the 3 years between that moment and this one. She found him in the library that evening. He was at his desk, not working, sitting with a glass of untouched whiskey and the look of a man engaged in a private argument he was not winning. She closed the door behind her. He looked up. She crossed the room and stood before his desk and said, "My mother told me what you asked her." He said nothing. She said, "You wrote it all down." He said, "I wanted to know you, all of it, not only what you are now." She said, "Raphael." It was the first time she had used his name. He went very still. She said, "You are the most complicated, indirect, and infuriating man I have ever encountered." He said, "I know." She said, "And I think you have been in love with me since the rain." A long silence. Then he said, "Yes." Just that. No justification, no management, just the truth, laid down without protection the way you lay something heavy when your arms have finally given out. She reached across the desk and took the untouched whiskey and set it aside and took his hand instead. She said, "Then say so next time. Say it in the rain. Do not drive away." He turned his hand over and held hers properly. His grip was careful, the way it was on the piano keys, as though he was holding something that could break and had decided it would not. He said, "I will not drive away again." Outside the library windows, the Wiltshire dark had settled over the grounds. Inside, the fire had burned low. Somewhere in the south wing, her mother was sleeping in a warm room that smelled of lavender and old wood. and Ilara Voss, who ironed her own wedding dress on the morning of her marriage, who walked down the aisle alone with street vendor roses, who had been told by a solicitor that she was a suitable candidate for the position of Duchess. Ilara Voss sat in the library of her own house, holding the hand of a man who loved her since the reign and had simply not known how to say so until she made him. She thought that was probably enough. She thought, in fact, it was everything. Some men declare love loudly in ballrooms before witnesses. Some men spend 3 years arranging the world so that love can arrive without breaking anything. Ilara married the second kind, and she had decided in the end that she did not mind at all.